The Tonight Show was alive that night, filled with warm laughter, playful jokes, and the kind of energy only Johnny Carson could create. The band played softly in the background, the audience clapped along, and everything felt smooth, effortless, perfect. Johnny leaned back in his chair, tossing out one witty line after another, keeping the studio glowing with joy. No one, not the audience, not the crew, not even Johnny himself, had any idea that in just a few seconds, the entire room would fall into a silence so heavy it could be touched. Johnny introduced his next guest with his usual charm. The audience cheered. The cameras panned. The guest walked onto the stage smiling confidently, waving at the crowd. The conversation started casually, lighthearted, almost friendly. People laughed. Johnny nodded along, guiding the discussion like he always did, until something shifted. Out of nowhere, in the middle of a harmless remark, the guest casually slipped in a racist slur. It was quick, almost disguised, almost delivered like a joke. But Johnny heard it. The audience heard it. And within seconds, the entire Tonight Show studio froze. The laughter died instantly. The smiles faded. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Johnny's expression changed. His eyes narrowed slightly, his posture stiffened, and the card in his hand stopped midair. It was the look of a man who had just witnessed something he could not, and would not, let pass. The audience didn't know how to react. Some exchanged confused glances. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few people let out nervous chuckles, unsure if this was part of the routine or a moment that had gone terribly wrong. Johnny didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't even move. For the first time in a long career filled with surprises, Johnny Carson allowed complete silence to take over his show. You could feel a storm building behind his calm expression, a storm everyone in that room felt, but only Johnny knew how he was going to unleash. And then, he slowly placed his cue cards on the desk, looked straight at the guest, and the audience sensed. What Johnny did next would change The Tonight Show forever. The silence in The Tonight Show studio didn't fade. It grew heavier with every passing second. Johnny Carson still hadn't spoken. His audience, usually roaring with laughter, sat frozen in their seats. The band members exchanged looks, but didn't play a single note. Even the camera operators weren't sure if they should zoom in, pull back, or cut to commercial. Everyone was waiting for Johnny. Everyone needed to know how he would respond. But Johnny wasn't rushing. He was letting the weight of the moment sink into every corner of the studio. The guest, who had dropped the slur so casually, shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Their confident smile was gone, replaced with confusion, maybe even fear. They finally realized this wasn't going to disappear into the noise of comedy. Johnny leaned back in his chair, staring at the desk for a moment as if collecting his thoughts. Then, very slowly, he lifted his head and looked at the guest. The firmness in his eyes said more than any punchline ever could. The audience braced. Johnny finally spoke. "What was that?" he asked quietly. Not angry, not shouting, not dramatic, just calm, controlled, and piercing. The guest attempted a shaky laugh. "Oh, I was just joking around," they said. "You know, just trying to be funny." Johnny cut in, his voice low but unwavering. "Say it again." The guest froze. The audience gasped softly. Nobody saw that coming. Johnny wasn't asking because he hadn't heard it. He was asking because the world needed to hear what had just been said, clearly, unmistakably. The guest swallowed hard. "Johnny, it was just a joke." Johnny shook his head. "No. Say it again." The studio became even more tense. You could hear someone shifting in their seat way at the back. A crew member took off his headphones. People in the front row exchanged looks, unsure whether this was about to become one of the most uncomfortable moments in Tonight Show history, or one of the most important. The guest looked around nervously, as if searching for someone, anyone, who might rescue them. But no one could. The cameras were rolling. The lights were bright. The truth was exposed. Finally, the guest muttered the slur again. This time, no one laughed. Not even nervously. Johnny's expression hardened like stone. He placed his hands on the desk slowly and deliberately, as if anchoring himself. Then he leaned forward. "Do you think that's funny?" Johnny asked. The guest opened their mouth, but no words came out. Johnny wasn't done. "You're sitting in front of millions of people, and you think mocking someone's race is a punchline." The words hit like thunder. The audience inhaled sharply, some out of shock, others out of admiration. They had never seen Johnny Carson like this. The guest stuttered. "Johnny, please, I didn't mean." Johnny raised a hand. Not angrily, just firmly. "Stop." The guest fell silent instantly. Johnny turned to the audience, speaking not as a comedian, not as a host, but as a man who understood the responsibility of a platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are better than this." The audience erupted into applause, not loud, enthusiastic applause, but slow, heavy claps of agreement. People nodded. Some looked emotional. Others stared at Johnny with newfound respect. The guest shrunk in their chair. Johnny continued, "A slur is not a joke. It's a wound. It's history. And tonight, on this stage, we do not use this platform to hurt people." The applause grew louder. Behind the cameras, producers whispered urgently, unsure if they should cut to break, but Johnny lifted a hand to signal, "Don't cut." He wanted every second of this moment to air. He looked back at the guest. "If you want to be funny, be funny. But don't come on this show and spread hatred." The guest's face turned pale. They nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," they whispered. Johnny stared at them a moment longer before finally sitting back in his chair. The tension in the room shifted, not gone, but transformed. The audience felt pride, relief, respect. They had just witnessed something rare, a man using his influence, not for a laugh, but for integrity. Before moving on, Johnny addressed the camera directly, something he almost never did mid-show. "To everyone watching," he said, "we must remember, jokes should lift people up, not push them down." The audience applauded again, louder this time, moved by the clarity of his message. Then he smiled just slightly, trying to bring the moment back to familiar territory. "Now, let's see if we can salvage this conversation." The studio exhaled collectively. Which country or city are you watching from? Write it in the comments. Little did anyone know, this moment was only the beginning. What Johnny would do next would turn a TV incident into a historic stand. The studio had barely recovered from the shock of Johnny Carson confronting the racist remark. The applause faded slowly, but the weight of the moment still pressed down on everyone. Johnny, usually so quick with a joke or a witty escape, didn't reach for humor this time. He let the silence linger, a silence more powerful than any punchline he had ever delivered. The guests sat rigidly, trying to hide their embarrassment, but it was too late. Their confidence had evaporated. Their forced smile twitched at the corners, unable to return. They kept glancing around, hoping someone, anyone, would rescue them from the mess they created. But no one could. Not tonight. Johnny leaned forward again, elbows on the desk, studying the guest with a mixture of disappointment and restrained anger. He wasn't looking to humiliate them. He wasn't interested in revenge. But he knew millions were watching, and what he did next would define the moment. "Do you understand why what you said is wrong?" Johnny asked calmly. The guest blinked rapidly. I said I'm sorry. It was just a joke." Johnny finished for them. The guest nodded weakly. Johnny exhaled. "There's a difference between a joke and an insult. A joke makes people laugh. An insult makes people smaller." The audience murmured in agreement. Even those who came expecting nothing more than entertainment now sat forward, hanging on to every word. Johnny continued, "But let's make something very clear. Tonight is not about punishing you. It's about teaching everyone watching that we cannot normalize this." The guest swallowed, still visibly shaken. Johnny's tone was controlled but unyielding, the voice of a man who stood on a line drawn by his own principles, unwilling to step back. A producer at the side of the stage motioned again, signaling whether they should cut to commercial. Johnny shook his head gently. Not yet. Not while hearts were pounding and eyes were glued to the stage. Johnny turned his attention to the studio audience. "You know," he said, "I've been doing this show a long time. And I've heard a lot of things, some clever, some dumb, some outrageous. But I've never let this stage be used to push people down. We're supposed to bring joy, not harm." He looked out over the crowd. Their faces held sorrow, admiration, even guilt, as if they themselves had been reminded of something they too easily forgot. Johnny leaned back for a moment, rubbing his thumb across his cue cards, thinking. Then he set them aside. "You know," he added softly, "I grew up seeing people judged for the color of their skin, their names, their background. I saw friends hurt because someone decided their worth before knowing them. And it stays with you. You don't forget." The audience fell silent again. This wasn't the Tonight Show anymore. This was Johnny Carson, the man, speaking from something deep inside. He looked back at the guest. You have an opportunity here to understand the impact of your words. Don't waste it. The guest nodded again, too ashamed to meet his eyes. Johnny straightened in his chair. His voice shifted slightly, warming, grounding the moment. We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we learn from them. The tension eased, not gone, but softened just enough for the room to breathe again. Johnny lifted his hand toward the crowd as if inviting them back into the moment. And speaking of learning, he turned toward the camera, smiling slightly, not for comedy, but connection. Have you ever witnessed someone being insulted publicly? Tell me in the comments, and let's talk about why dignity matters. The engagement line echoed softly through the studio, and even that felt heavier than usual, like an invitation to reflect rather than simply interact. Johnny turned back to his guest. I don't hate you, he said quietly. I don't think you're a bad person. But tonight, this stage becomes a reminder. We don't stand by silently when someone tries to tear another person down. The guest finally found their voice. Johnny, you're right. I was wrong. I shouldn't have said it. I'm genuinely sorry. Johnny studied their face. The apology, shaky as it was, felt real. He nodded once. Good. Own it. Don't run from it. If you truly mean it, then you'll walk away from tonight better than you arrived. The audience applauded, this time with genuine emotion. It wasn't for entertainment. It was for humanity. Johnny smiled gently, easing the tension even further. Now let's reset. Let's see if we can move forward with respect, something this world could always use a little more of. The band finally played a soft, tentative note, a sign of relief, of rhythm returning. But deep inside the audience, whispers began to form. Did you see that? Johnny shut the whole show down for that. He really stood up today. What they didn't know, what even Johnny didn't realize, was that this moment was about to become one of the most rewatched, reshared, and discussed moments in Tonight Show history. Because the story wasn't over. Not even close. As the band played a soft, hesitant cue, the tension in the studio began to shift, not disappear, but transform into something heavier, something meaningful. The audience knew they had witnessed something powerful, but they still didn't understand the full depth of what was unfolding in front of them. This wasn't just Johnny reacting. This wasn't just a moment of anger. This was something historic. Johnny Carson sat upright at his desk, the weight of the incident settling into his shoulders not as a burden, but as a responsibility. The lights above the stage hummed quietly. The cameras continued rolling. Every crew member, every audience member, every person in that space sensed that Johnny had stepped out of the role of late-night entertainer and into the role of a leader. The guests shifted again, visibly shaken. Their hands trembled slightly as they tried to compose themselves, keeping a fragile smile on their face. But the smile didn't reach their eyes. The confidence, the ego, the swagger they walked in with, all evaporated. Now they looked like someone standing on a cliff's edge, unsure if they would fall or be pulled back. Johnny tapped his pencil lightly on the desk, 1, 2, 3 times. The soft clicking echoed across the studio. Then he placed it aside and took a deep breath. You know, he began, his voice calm but carrying more weight than ever. People think comedy is simple. They think it's just jokes, timing, and a good punchline. But comedy is powerful. It can heal, it can unite, and it can hurt. Deeply. The audience listened without blinking. This wasn't Johnny performing. This was Johnny explaining his soul. He turned his gaze toward the crowd, studying their expressions. Some leaned forward. Some sat with hands curled in their laps. A few looked shaken, as if the moment connected with a memory they hadn't touched in years. I remember, Johnny continued, a young kid I grew up with. He was different from everyone else. Not in a bad way, just different. And he was mocked, ridiculed, pushed around, all because of who he was. I'll never forget the day I saw him break down. Alone. Hurt. He paused, letting the heaviness settle. And that was the day I promised myself, if I ever had a platform, if I ever had a voice people actually listened to, I'd use it for good. Not for tearing people apart. A soft murmur rippled through the audience, a mix of sadness, respect, and realization. People looked at each other with gentle nods, as if silently agreeing. This is bigger than a show. On the side of the stage, one of the camera crew whispered, This is something else. Another nodded, keeping his camera steady. No one dared interrupt or shift their focus. Everyone knew that history was unfolding, even if they couldn't fully see it yet. Johnny continued, "Tonight isn't the first time someone has said something ugly on this stage, but it's the first time. I feel the world needs to hear the truth loud and clear." He turned to the guest once more, not with anger, but with a kind of firm compassion. "You made a mistake. A big one. But a mistake is only fatal when you refuse to learn from it." The guest nodded silently, ashamed but listening, truly listening. Then something unexpected happened. A woman in the audience whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "He's right. That word hurt me too." People turned toward her. She didn't shrink. She lifted her chin, eyes glistening. Others nodded. One man whispered, "People don't understand how deep it cuts." The energy in the room shifted dramatically, from shock to solidarity. People now connected the moment to their own experiences with discrimination and hurt. Johnny saw this. He recognized the pain, the unity, the awakening happening before his eyes. He softened his expression and addressed the room. "We're not perfect. None of us. But if we don't speak up when something's wrong, who will?" Another wave of applause, stronger, louder, more emotional this time, filled the studio. The guests looked around, their shame deepening, but so did their understanding. Johnny allowed the applause to rise and fall. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Let me tell you something," he said. "This show reaches millions. Children, families, people who might already be battling prejudice out there in the world. What message would I send if I let that kind of language slip by without stopping everything?" He didn't wait for the answer. "I'll tell you," he continued. "I'd be saying it's okay. And it's not. It never will be." The audience rose in parts, small pockets of people instinctively standing up, moved by his words. The guests stared at their hands, visibly overwhelmed. Johnny offered a small, warm smile. "We're all here to laugh, to feel good, to forget our troubles for a moment. And I want everyone, to feel welcome in this space." Those final words resonated through the studio like a quiet anthem. A man sitting in the front row whispered to his wife, "Johnny isn't just hosting tonight. He's making a statement." And the truth was, Johnny had not only taken control of the moment, he had transformed it. What began as a harmful comment had become a lesson, a stand, a declaration of who Johnny Carson was and what The Tonight Show represented. But the story wasn't done. The turning point was still ahead. Because what Johnny Carson did next would turn a tense confrontation into a historic stand remembered for decades. The studio was electric, though still tense. Every seat in the audience felt charged with anticipation, every eye glued to Johnny Carson. He had paused The Tonight Show. He had confronted the racist remark. But now, he was about to take a stand that would be remembered far beyond the walls of the studio, far beyond the night it occurred. Johnny leaned forward, hands resting lightly on his desk, and spoke in a voice calm, yet filled with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this isn't just about words. It's about responsibility. It's about integrity. It's about the fact that we all have a choice, every single day, to either lift people up or push them down." The audience hung on every word. Not a single person dared interrupt. The guest, who had caused the tension, shrank further into their seat. They had expected some humor, some casual resolution. They had not expected Johnny Carson to take the moral high ground with such precision and unwavering calm. "You see," Johnny continued, "a slur is never just a word. It carries history. It carries pain. It carries generations of suffering that some of us have seen firsthand." He paused, letting the words sink in. The room seemed to breathe in unison, absorbing the gravity of the message. "I've spent decades making people laugh," he said softly, almost reflective. "I've shared countless jokes, countless moments of humor. But never, not once, have I allowed that humor to come at the expense of someone else's dignity." The guests' eyes widened. Sweat formed on their brow. They realized now, perhaps for the first time, that the stage was not a playground, and The Tonight Show was not just entertainment. This was a moment of accountability. Johnny's voice strengthened. "Tonight, I am stopping the show. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because silence is complicity. And this platform reaches millions of people, millions of viewers, children, families, people learning who they are and who the world is. And if we do not set the example, if we do not say this is unacceptable, then who will? The audience leaned forward. Some whispered to neighbors, "He's right. He's absolutely right." Johnny paused for a moment, scanning the room. His eyes caught the cameras, the crew, the people in the back row, all of them witnesses to a historic stand. And then he fixed his gaze on the guest. "You may think it's a joke," Johnny said steadily. "You may think it's harmless. But it is not. And now, it is your responsibility to understand why. Not because I say so, not because the audience claps, but because it is the right thing to do." The guest nodded, but words failed them. The shame, the understanding, the weight of being called to account, it was all too real. Johnny turned to the audience again, his tone firm but compassionate. "We live in a world where we are constantly faced with choices. And every choice matters. Every word we speak matters. And tonight, I am choosing to use this moment for good. To teach, to remind, to inspire." The room erupted into applause, slow at first, then building, then thunderous. Not the kind of applause that greeted a clever joke, but the kind that rises from the soul. The audience was clapping not just for Johnny, but for the courage, the integrity, the clarity of his message. Johnny allowed the applause to fade. Then he leaned slightly forward and added a final thought that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. Comedy is a gift. Entertainment is a gift. And with that gift comes responsibility. We can make people laugh. We can make them happy. But we cannot, and we must not, ever tear them down. Not here. Not anywhere. A hush fell over the studio. Even the guests seemed transformed, their earlier arrogance replaced with genuine humility. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Some audience members whispered prayers of gratitude, silently thanking Johnny Carson for speaking truth in a world that often avoided it. He straightened in his chair, smiling gently. "So tonight, we continue the show. But let it be known, there are lines that will never be crossed. And if anyone tries, we will speak. We will stand. We will remind the world what is right." The applause rose again, louder and more heartfelt than ever. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment with the kind of intimacy that only live television could provide. Crew members exchanged glances. They knew they had just witnessed a moral lesson as much as a late-night show performance. Johnny glanced back at the guest, offering a nod, not a scolding, but an acknowledgement of accountability. The guest, humbled, could only nod in return. At that moment, something unspoken passed through the room. The Tonight Show had shifted. It was no longer just entertainment. It was history. It was an example of courage, integrity, and the power of using one's platform wisely. And far beyond the studio walls, millions watching would feel the impact. Messages would be shared. Headlines would be written. People would talk. And the lesson, loud, clear, and unforgettable, would echo far beyond that night. The tension in the Tonight Show studio had shifted from shock to awe. The audience sat riveted, cameras rolling, every eye fixed on Johnny Carson as he continued to speak with measured authority. The guest, once confident and smug, now squirmed uncomfortably in their chair, fully aware of the moral weight that Johnny had placed upon them. But even with Johnny's commanding words, not everyone in the studio fully understood the magnitude of what was happening. Some audience members whispered, some fidgeted, and some stared wide-eyed at the stage, caught between disbelief and admiration. Then, unexpectedly, one of the production assistants leaned closer to the side crew and whispered something that immediately spread like wildfire across the studio floor. "Did you know that the person who just corrected that guest is the real Johnny Carson?" A ripple went through the audience, though many had already realized the truth. Whispers grew louder. Some people clutched their phones, starting to film. Others gasped audibly. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the reactions, the quiet murmurings, the growing energy in the room. For the guest, it was a shock. Suddenly, the weight of the moment doubled. Not only had they been publicly corrected for their offensive remark, but now they realized they were standing in front of someone whose reputation, whose career, commanded respect around the world. And yet, Johnny did not use his fame as a weapon. He had never raised his status to intimidate or belittle. Instead, he had chosen to lead with integrity, courage, and humility. The audience began clapping again, softly at first, then more confidently. Some stood, others nodded, but all recognized the power of the moment. Johnny's message wasn't just about correcting a mistake. It was about teaching the responsibility of words, the weight of actions, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Johnny turned back to the guest, his gaze firm but gentle. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about every single person watching this show tonight, and every single person who will see this moment long after the cameras are off. You made a choice. You can continue to spread harm, or you can learn and grow and choose to respect others. That choice is yours." The guest nodded, visibly humbled. The once smug expression had completely vanished. Sweat dampened their brow, and their hands fidgeted nervously. There was no escape from accountability. But Johnny's calm delivery allowed the lesson to land fully, without shame for the sake of entertainment. The audience felt the impact. Phones were recording. The murmurs had turned into cheers. The energy in the room had shifted from tense to inspired. People were witnessing a moment of moral courage that would not be forgotten. Johnny looked at the cameras, engaging the millions watching from home. If you were in Johnny Carson's place, would you have stopped the show too? Comment yes or no and share your thoughts. The guest finally spoke, voice trembling. I understand now. I was wrong. Thank you for showing me what respect truly means." Johnny nodded once, satisfied that the message had been received. "Good. That's all anyone can ask for. That we learn from our mistakes and move forward with integrity." The audience erupted into sustained applause. The cheers were genuine, not for entertainment, but for courage, honesty, and accountability. People were moved. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others whispered quietly to neighbors, "That was incredible. I'll never forget this night." Johnny smiled softly, leaning back in his chair. He didn't boast. He didn't gloat. He had made his point, held the stage with dignity, and used the moment to teach the world a timeless lesson. As the studio began to settle, the guest left with a humbled expression. The crew exchanged glances, knowing they had just witnessed a historic, once-in-a-lifetime moment. The audience began to chatter excitedly, eager to share the story beyond the walls of the studio. And as the cameras kept rolling, Johnny Carson's words hung in the air. Words have power. And with that power comes responsibility. Never forget it. This was more than television. This was a stand against prejudice. This was history being made live. Little did anyone know, this moment would go viral. Clips would circulate worldwide. Millions would praise Johnny's courage, and the lesson of respect and integrity would reach far beyond the Tonight Show stage. The lights dimmed slightly in the Tonight Show studio, but the energy lingered, electric and unshakable. Johnny Carson had taken a stand, calm, firm, and unwavering. The guest had left humbled, the audience was inspired, and the crew realized they had captured something historic. What had begun as a moment of shock had transformed into a powerful statement of integrity and moral courage. Within hours, clips of the incident spread far beyond the studio walls. Millions across the country watched Johnny's response online, on television, and through early news broadcasts. People shared the footage, praising his courage, his dignity, and his refusal to let hate go unchecked. Conversations sparked in homes, offices, and schools. Discussions about respect, responsibility, and the power of words. Johnny's words had struck a chord far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Words have power, and with that power comes responsibility, he had said, and the message resonated across generations. Teachers replayed the clip in classrooms, parents discussed it with their children, and ordinary viewers felt inspired to speak up when they witnessed injustice. Meanwhile, the guest faced consequences in the public eye. Media outlets analyzed the moment, reflecting on the damage caused by casual racism and the accountability required when in the public spotlight. The humiliation was real, but so was the lesson. Harm may be inflicted with words, but integrity and courage have the power to transform moments of shame into teachable lessons. In the Tonight Show studio, Johnny Carson remained humble. He did not boast about the impact of his actions. He did not gloat over the guest's embarrassment. Instead, he used the moment to remind everyone watching, both live and at home, that leadership and courage often require calm, decisive action rather than anger or spectacle. The Tonight Show continued, but the episode would never be forgotten. Fans, viewers, and journalists would recall the night when Johnny paused the world around him, using his platform not just for laughter, but for justice. The lesson was simple yet profound. Never let prejudice go unchecked, and always use your voice for good. Even weeks later, millions still shared the story online. Clips resurfaced, discussions reignited, and the hashtags #respect, #Johnny Carson, and #LiveWithIntegrity trended in communities around the world. The incident had become more than television. It had become a movement, a call to stand up, to speak out, and to demand respect for all. And as the story reached viewers everywhere, Johnny's final words in that moment continued to inspire. Comedy should lift people up, never tear them down. It was a reminder that influence comes with responsibility, and that courage is measured not in spectacle, but in the strength to uphold what is right when it matters most. The Tonight Show had returned to its rhythm of jokes and laughter, but the message remained alive, a beacon for anyone witnessing injustice, a challenge to act, and a legacy of moral courage that would outlive the broadcast itself. If you believe no one should be judged by appearance or words, type respect in the comments. Share this story to inspire others, and subscribe for more powerful, true stories of courage and dignity. History had been made, not in anger or revenge, but in calm, unwavering integrity. A reminder that one person's voice can change the world.